Hi, everybody. My name is Dennis Godlewski, and I'm here with the person whom I personally don't think needs any introduction, a longtime activist, advocate. Now he's also a writer, an author of the book called My Fucking Memoir. Oh, sorry, Never Silent.
You you enjoyed my working title.
Oh, I did. I actually believe it should have been called like this, but they would never publish, I suppose.
Exactly.
So here is Peter Stейли. Peter, good to have you. Thank you for your time.
Great to be here, Dennis.
So my first question, as we discussed, we sort of all heard the news that Dr. Fauci announced that he'll be leaving soon. And as a person who witnessed it all, do you remember even the first time you saw Dr. Fauci, like in person, or heard of him, and what was your impression?
Well, I heard of him before I met him, and I don't actually have a clear memory of when we first met. But my best guess is that it was at the pretty famous International AIDS Conference in Montreal in 1989, where where AIDS activists made a huge splash at that conference. That was the conference where you know, prior to that, only scientists attended AIDS conferences, and ACT UP had a demonstration outside before the opening ceremony, and at the unplanned, we just decided to storm in and seize the stage of the opening ceremony, and then we forged a lot of IDs and attended the conference for the rest of the week, and we just made this huge splash. And from that point on, conference organizers figured out how to kind of let us in legally, um, starting in San Francisco the following year. But uh, we certainly knew, as we were learning who our targets were going to be in ACT UP, uh, that Fauci was definitely on our radar. He was considered the head of AIDS research for the U.S. government.
Mhm.
He was in charge of the largest institute at the National Institutes of Health that did AIDS research. So there were a bunch of institutes that did some AIDS research. There wasn't an Institute of AIDS. So it was kind of spread around. But the National Institutes of Allergies and Infectious Disease, which he was in charge of, they had like well over half the AIDS budget. And he was pretty much considered head of AIDS research. So we knew we'd have to deal with him. But our first target in 1988 was the FDA, Food and Drug Administration. And that was because they didn't do AIDS research, but they oversaw it as a regulator to make sure the trials were run correctly, and they ultimately decided whether a drug comes to market or not, whether they could approve it. So they were the primary regulator, and we were angry that they were taking forever to uh, design trials and uh, approve drugs, and that they were a roadblock. So our first target was the FDA, and our initial relationship with Tony Fauci kind of surprised us because we pretty quickly discovered in very right away January 1989, a couple months after we had done our gigantic coming out nationally by surrounding the FDA headquarters. ACT UP's most famous demonstration.
Yeah.
Seized control of the FDA. That was in October of '88. And we learned a couple months later that Tony Fauci shared many of our critiques of the FDA. And he helped us with one of our first issues
Which
on
one?
a kind of on a micro level on a specific drug, ganciclovir, that was being in clinical trials to see whether it could block the blindness that could happen in people with HIV from a certain virus, and CMV retinitis. Ganciclovir looked very promising, and the FDA was insisting on even though they had good data, they were insisting on another trial.
Yeah.
And Tony agreed with us that trial was unnecessary. So we found, we met with him, and he agreed to intervene with the FDA. And within weeks, the FDA dropped its demand for another trial, and ganciclovir was approved. And ACT UP scored this major victory that was covered in the New York Times. Fauci looked like a hero. We put ACT UP on the map, and we were like, oh, this is some synergy we can work with. Let's see if we can test that, because we have far bigger eggs to fry with the FDA. We had designed this program, which we called Parallel Track, which would expand access to experimental AIDS drugs, allowing thousands of people to take those drugs before they were given final approval, while they were still in phase 2, phase 3, their final clinical trial. For those who couldn't get in the trial, there would be a parallel track where doctors could enroll them and do basic data monitoring, kind of a large observational trial that anybody could get into. This was ACT UP's idea. And we tried it, we pitched it. We really wanted to test this synergy with Anthony Fauci. So we pitched the idea to Fauci and said, would you endorse this? Because to have the head of the AIDS research for the US government endorse an activist, the number one activist plank against the FDA, would be huge.
Of course.
And that's when it was during that press of Tony Fauci to get his sign off that I met him in Montreal. We started pushing him that spring in '89. Jim Igo confronted him at some obscure AIDS conference, and he actually said, "It sounds like a very intriguing." His initial opinion was, "I like this idea," and then we spent the next couple months, including a couple meetings in Montreal, hashing out the details of exactly what this program would look like, this regulatory scheme. And I definitely remember right after Montreal, going into his office for the first time. And it was me and Mark Harrington and Jim Igo. And we went in there, and you're surrounded by hundreds of awards. The guy, the guy has awards just on every surface and every wall of that office. Is just overwhelming. So you realize you're dealing with somebody who's pretty esteemed, with a track record in the scientific community. He's as high as you go. He was very comfortable with us, and it that was my first time in his office, but he had opened that door to other people in ACT UP uh, to discuss ganciclovir in January. And he had been talking to Bill Ballman, a member of ACT UP's Treatment and Data Committee, since ACT UP's first year in 1987. So he had this record of letting us in right from day one. And you can't, you have to remember how unusual that was. I mean, most government officials thought we were crazy. They were scared of us. We were these radical homosexuals who just screamed and didn't understand. They felt that we didn't understand how things were done. They placated us and avoided us. But he was like, yeah, I'll talk to him. There was never a closed door. There was never this, even though he had these millions of awards, there was never this I'm going to speak down to you attitude, and you don't know what you're talking about. There were times he thought we didn't know what we were talking about, but he would do what, as people saw during COVID on television, he would explain, he would try to explain things from his perspective in a respectful way, in a way you could understand. He's famous for not talking down to people, even though he's a brilliant guy and he knows his stuff and he deserved those awards. But so, and within 2 weeks, there was an article again on the front page of the New York Times. AIDS researcher endorses early access to drugs before approval. So he endorsed it, and hysterically, within the first few paragraphs, it had a quote from him saying, "I call it parallel track," even though it was ACT UP's. So we saw the self-promotion as well. He looked like a hero again, but ACT UP was all through the article as well. And it really put us on the map as a movement. Within less than a year, we had won everything, pretty much everything we had fought for against the FDA. And we won it with heavy lifts, with heavy assistance from none other than Anthony Fauci. So that was our initial dealings with the guy. And history's got it, history is been misremembering that first year, because most people hear the narrative that it started in conflict. But that's not actually how it started. It started with a lot of synergy as we were focused on the FDA. But once we got parallel track, and by the end of that year, there were tens of thousands of patients taking the second AIDS drug, DDI, on parallel track before it was approved the following year. Within a year, we scored this huge victory. Once we got everything out of the FDA, we pivoted to the NIH. And that's when all of a sudden we were in conflict with Tony. So it's a different narrative than the history books kind of realize. But at that point, it was conflict. And we had major problems with how he was running AIDS research within NIAID and at the NIH. And it was game on at that point to try to get him to do a better job.
Before we get deeper to this conflict, I wanted to stop at one thing that you have mentioned a couple of times. You said that on one hand, and there is this famous quote from, I think, somebody who said to you, you should get your heads out of your crouches or something, the political person or religious person on the TV somewhere. And there was
Jesse Helms, I think.
Yeah. That's the narrative that was surrounding you. But then you said you had proposals on parallel track, you had proposals on you had treatment and data committee. Many people, young activists even now, they think that ACT UP was about protest and yelling and banging the doors and chaining themselves to pharmaceutical companies, which is all true. But what you can tell, and how did it work with all that geeky and nerdy stuff that helped you not to be tricked out at the table with all of these scientists and all these pharmaceutical reps?
We had this incredibly complex problem in front of us. We had a scientific problem in front of us, and none of us were scientists. There were a few members that were within this that had studied science, but very few. And our major problem was that we were dying from a virus that had been that took quite a few years to discover, and that was a unique virus, and that the science knew very little about, and there was very little record of the medical establishment successfully coming up with drugs to fight viruses in general, let alone what turned out to be the craftiest virus in human history. So the problem, the only way we were going to save our lives was to engage that issue. We couldn't just scream in the streets and hope that the scientists figured it out on their own. If we were going to be taken seriously by the scientific establishment, we had to talk their language. We had to know what we were talking about, and we had to craft very specific demands to move the ball forward. And that meant we had to get our hands dirty and our minds dirty. We had to dive in and become experts in all these realms: immunology, virology, the regulatory system, all the government agencies involved in the scientific establishment and infectious disease. And it was a huge, steep learning curve. But my God, I witnessed something beautiful. I forever believed, having witnessed it myself, it's an incredible thing. I really believe that there is no learning curve steep enough that a person with enough drive can't climb it quickly. We're intimidated by those. You look at nuclear fusion, and how am I going to understand that? And if your life was on the line, you could learn almost as much as the most expert nuclear scientists in about a year or two, if you really put your mind to it. So, and that's this hidden secret that most people don't know. So we put ourselves on a crash course, and we started these little working groups, and we got the textbooks. This was before the internet. We learned immunology 101 and virology 101, and we learned all the players, and within 5 years, definitely by year 3, we were able to have very informed conversations with the Faucis of the world. And by year 5, we often were better than people who were doing only their segment, like a virologist, because we knew we were balanced. We were more balanced than they were. We knew all the players in government and the frontline public health officials, and we knew immunology, not just virology. And we became vital members of the public health establishment, and that's how we started affecting change.
Probably you have heard these questions back then 100 times, but what do you answer when they ask you in this top-down tone of voice, excuse me, are you a doctor? What was your typical answer?
No, definitely not a doctor, and you keep that in mind. But you just engage, you just engage them in a specific scientific debate, and they realize you've done your homework. So they let go of the degree stuff, as long as you show them that you've done your homework.
I think that's the perfect message to all of you guys over there who is doubting whether I can. You can, and that's the proof. So now back to the later stage of the relationship with Fauci. So there was this famous protest at NIH, and how did it come from the synergy to this magnitude of a conflict that you had to storm the building?
Well, as we pivoted to looking at how the AIDS research effort at the NIH was kind of not producing much, and really did a deep dive into that, it was a mess. And Fauci was in charge of it. And it wasn't just us that thought that. There had been congressional hearings that had looked at the clinical trials program that he started and found many problems. It was a bureaucratic mess. It was too safe. It was too slow. So we developed a whole specific list of demands, and we started pressing him on those. He tried to placate us by expanding the meetings to actual dinners that were happening. He invited us to, he had his deputy, the deputy director of NIAID, a guy named Dr. Jim Hill, was a closeted gay man and a really good cook. So Tony thought it would be kind of like smart politics to have this neutral territory where we would feel comfortable as gay New Yorkers being hosted by this Southern gay man, Jim Hill, for long dinners at his house in DC over multiple bottles of wine with Fauci. But we did tons of strategizing on those dinners and made sure that we, weren't a pushover for what I call the full Fauch. His gregarious friendliness and persuasion. And we And we realized, we would process these dinners and realize he had said, "Oh, I hear you, but it's going to take time." And a lot of it was foot dragging. A lot of it was, trying to say he kind of agreed with us, but it was he had to do this and this and this, and it just wasn't happening fast enough. So at one of those dinners, I was given the task of telling him that we had had enough of his sweet talk, and we had scheduled a gigantic demonstration in front of his building and at the NIH. He was upset. He tried to talk us out of it, but he failed, and it was time to put a fire under his ass. And we did this gigantic demonstration, and I was one of the first people to be arrested that day, climbing up onto the overhang over the front door of his building and getting dramatically arrested, tackled, and lowered down off that, and then hysterically,
Everybody
as
who
I'm being
saw this
as
video,
I'm being dragged through the building.
everybody should also say it was incredibly hot.
But off camera, hysterically, the cop takes me through the building to get me out back where the police vans were. Walking down the hall towards us was a short man in a white lab coat that I instantly recognized. And I have this big African-American cop. My hands are bound behind my back, and he's got my shoulder, and he's dragging me down the hall. And I go, "Tony?" And there it's Fauci. And he goes, "Peter, you okay?" I said, "I'm okay. How about you?" I said, "I'm just doing my job. How about you?" And the cop is like looking at me like, "Who the fuck is this?" Because he recognizes Fauci. It was hysterical. And so that's the kind of strange, but within months, he gave us one of our major demands at the within 1 month at the San Francisco AIDS conference. He buckled, and we had demanded to have patient representatives, people with HIV, on all the committees that decided which clinical trials to do and design them, etc. All the scientists on those committees didn't want us there, and we had been pushing him to tell them that they had to let us on. And he finally caved a month later. And those advocates over the following years, working with the scientists, slowly but surely worked on the list of demands that we had for those clinical trials, making them more diverse, letting more women in, letting more people of color in, looking at trials for more experimental drugs, looking at trials for drugs that would fight the opportunistic infections that were killing people with HIV. So all of those demands slowly got worked on over the subsequent years and improved. So that access was huge. And that demonstration, I think, is one of ACT UP's greatest successes, along with the one at the FDA.
On this,
and Fauci, to his credit, looks back on that whole experience and says, and says that we created a new paradigm, that there's before ACT UP and after ACT UP, that patient advocates can actually help the public health establishment fight an infectious disease and speed things up and give them a sense of the stakes and help them design clinical trials. that enroll quicker and get answers quicker. And you saw that with COVID, how the vaccines came out so much faster. All of the systems that came out of AIDS, like emergency use authorization, is a different version of what ACT UP created with the FDA. The AIDS clinical trials group, which is the group that Fauci set up, that we reformed, that's still in existence, and it was put into service with Moderna's vaccine when they were having trouble enrolling people of color in the U.S. Fauci used the ACTG to do that. So again and again and again, we showed how things in a crisis, without sacrificing the basic tenets of scientific research, that you could do things faster. There were ways to speed things up, and we saw that with COVID, and that's what Fauci learned from us.
Before we speak more about COVID, I have one ethical, moral maybe question, because we have all, I think, witnessed people who are activists and who are right by your side, and at a certain point you got engaged together into some fight with pharmaceutical companies or with scientific communities and debate, and then slowly but surely sometimes it happens that those people get grants from pharma. They start to become members of various committees. Their personal profile starts to raise bigger, and they become sort of gurus among the community. And somehow they become, I don't want to say the word traitor, right? Because that's too loud. But somehow you feel they start to liaison on the other side of the table with you, being kind of from the same background. And I have a feeling, maybe I'm wrong, that back then it did not happen much. So what do you think? What was the thing that helped you guys to stick together, to follow this agenda that you mentioned, that we have these demands, despite of whatever committee we are included, we stick to this agenda, we don't sell out, and all of that? What was the motivator?
The key way you avoid co-optation, as you're describing it, is to not get yourself in a situation where one activist, like one famous activist is doing negotiating, a Larry Kramer or something. You always work in coalition, you always work in groups. And it is through the group that you plan for every meeting. And after every meeting, you analyze exactly what you got and didn't get, and what happened and didn't happen. It's that's why we decided early on that we would never meet Tony Fauci, just one of us at a time. We would always send at least 3 people to meet the guy. Because one person could be, you get the full Fauci, and you'd love we all ended up loving the guy. He's extraordinarily personable, and he's as a human being, the decency of the man and is really impressive and extraordinary, and we all call him a friend now. But as a group, you recognize those feelings. You can all laugh about them, and then you can say, yeah, but what about our issues?
Mm-hmm.
And you just make sure you have processes that that plan for the meeting in advance with lots of planning and who's going to say what and which issues are going to be discussed, and make sure you get through them in the time allotted. And then just as importantly is after the meeting is processing it, and having a long conversation where everyone returns to the issues after all the bottles of wine. You return to the issues and say, what happened with our issues? And that's what keeps away co-optation. If it were one person, there's a risk. If it's a group of dedicated activists, they keep each other in check, and they have a process they follow that constantly returns them to the issues, and that allows you to actually have the friendship with the target that you're pushing. And that became the basis of my relationship with Tony, where I learned to both adore the man as a person and as a friend, but never. But I also learned that I could push him really, really hard and tell him honestly where I thought he was fucking up. And to his credit, he's appreciated that. He never, a lot of people would push that away if they weren't getting a yes man out of a friendship. But he drew me in closer because to this day, I yell at him and I tell him, where he's fucking up, and he's still fucking up to this very day. We all are, right?
Of course,
there are no perfect people, and we all have our faults, and we all make mistakes daily. But to have that willingness to get that feedback and to hold that friend closer and not push them away is a rare asset. And I've witnessed it with him, and it's been very empowering, and it's something I hope I can incorporate into my own activism as well with my own friends.
What do you feel? What was the biggest fuck up with the COVID?
Well, it was not masks, which is what the far right loves to beat the hell out of him with. And it was certainly not all the crazy conspiracy theory stuff that they've thrown at him. But I personally thought he could have been had a stronger, even more independent voice during that year with Trump. And I also think that and this is understandable, he entered a period of his life where there were major bandwidth issues, where he went from a few hundred emails a day to close to 10,000 emails a day in 1 month, starting at the beginning of COVID. And he was dealing with so many fires and so many meetings and so many Zooms and daily trips to the White House, and that he no longer had the time to, he didn't even have a half hour during the day to himself to think about strategy, to think about how can I shepherd something through the US government. He was in reactive mode the whole year. And he just didn't have a second of the day to be proactive. and I don't think it had to be that way. I was constantly pressing him to take an axe to his schedule, and chop off a lot of the unnecessary stuff. He has a real hard problem not saying yes to everything. He feels he really has to be there for everyone. He really has to say yes to every invite, yes to every Zoom, yes to every press request. And that's just wrong in my mind. With a person that has that much power, they have to be brutally selfish about their time, and he's not. And I pounded him on that constantly. And I think it really cost him that first year because he had zero time for strategy, and it really showed. Uh, he was When we came to him during the Biden, after Biden took office, for international COVID vaccine work that we focused on. In the old days, he was able to shepherd a thing like PEPFAR into existence, which saved millions of lives with HIV/AIDS. We discovered that he had very little time to shepherd anything through the Biden administration. And so he got us meetings with others. And so we pressed other people to do their job. But we lost the Fauci of 2002 that created PEPFAR. We lost that Tony Fauci. And that's a shame. So I told him that constantly. So.
You mentioned the conspiracy theories. So, of course, we have all faced people like AIDS denialists, and nowadays people start to believe like real crazy stuff like a flat earth and things. And also on Tony Fauci, there is this specific book with his name on the cover and the name of Bill Gates, which was written by the person named Kennedy. Have you heard of the book, and what do you know of the guy, and how can you comment on this kind of publicity?
He is one of the Kennedys, and he's been disowned by the Kennedy family. He's a probably the most prominent leader of vaccine denialism, anti-vax movement, not just in HIV, but not just in COVID, but well before COVID. He had established himself as a crazy conspiracy theorist against vaccines in general. So his book is a joke, and I mean he's a joke. He's dangerous because of his name and prominence. But just like Duisberg, he will go down in history as a very dangerous zealot who ultimately did not win the day, but caused a lot of damage and caused the loss of a great many lives because of the conspiracies that he helped formulate. He's like a mad scientist, even though he's not a scientist. It's just the evil man scientist in a Hollywood movie. Those are the people who come after Tony Fauci these days the hardest. They're crazy, and it's very sad. It's the world we live in now. And all we can do is fight for the truth and fight for facts and fight for science and not give up on that front.
Why do you think it is happening that like a century ago people were standing in lines to have their shot from the various diseases that were killing them and started to wash their hands and do the hygiene, and all of a sudden we have all the tremendous reluctance and, you know, fake theories and all of that. What's wrong? What do you think about that?
I mean, it's just been what everybody's discussing. The internet is obviously playing a role. It's not just a U.S. problem; it's international.
Of course.
Anti-factualism is a movement of its own. QAnon, etc. The dark corners of the web. Anybody with a grudge or resentment now can latch on to these very easily and get sucked in. So we can't turn off the internet. So it's very, very discouraging and disappointing. And we just have to have a movement that constantly fights it, and isn't afraid of it and just pushes back so that the movement, the pro-science movement, remains a more dominant force for good against the evil movement that represents death and defeatism and nihilism, and anarchy.
Isn't it almost like science is also being influenced by this lowering the bar? Because what we have witnessed, looks like, during the COVID was science through press releases. Like, we heard of so many drugs that worked for COVID in press releases, then all of a sudden they didn't. The vaccines results of the trials were presented through the press releases, not the disclosure of the data. And so what's your opinion on that? Why why the pharma is doing that? Why the science is doing that? Why the independent institutions are tend to fall into that paradigm?
Well, I mean, there are micro debates on how to release scientific data, and there's some backsliding that always occurs. But there's also some, the old way of having this, the journals hold breakthrough data for months while they review it before the rest of the world can hear about it. That had its problems too. So the era of preprints, I think, has more upside than downside. But we all need to recognize the difference between a pharmaceutical company press release and how much data is released with it. And if there's very little data released with it, something's amiss, and you got to be very careful. So if we are going to speed up the release of data, then you have to insist on transparency, and you have to actually release the data. So, and let it get exposed to everyone for quick review.
Okay, getting back to the Fauci figure, probably the last or one of the last questions. Do you think, as David said and David Barr said in How to Survive a Plague, do you think it was luck? Do you think it was the role of the person in history, or do you think it was the role of the movement who influenced the person?
Well, David was right. It was all the pieces falling together finally at, in 1995, 96, where the science breakthrough finally happened. And everyone had there was no one individual that did it. But there were thousands of scientists, there were pharmaceutical companies, there was the NIH, there was FDA doing things faster. And there was a movement that greased the wheels and got the country to wake up, and got Republican presidents to start spending hundreds of millions on research. We loosened up the purse strings of the American taxpayer, so that over $1 billion was being spent on AIDS research by the time ACT UP was in its third year. So that was our biggest success. And those tax dollars eventually paid off. And we had what remains the biggest breakthrough in HIV/AIDS, of at least turning it from an assured death sentence into chronic manageable disease, assuming you could get access to the therapies that were out there. And ever since, we've been trying to work on those access issues, improve the therapies to make them easier, and find a vaccine and a cure to finally end this. And I hope Tony Fauci will be around to see both of those. I'm pretty sure I'm going to be around. I'm 20 years younger than he is, to see it. And that's the final chapter of AIDS that we're both writing today.
Do you think there is a need in activism still during this final chapter?
Absolutely. I mean, David and I are part of a group called Prep for All, that's trying to create a national PrEP access program for the drug that prevents HIV infections, and a national prevention program in general that will help slowly end the HIV epidemic in the US. So yeah, we're working on that final chapter. And I do think the vaccine front, I do think the cure research and the vaccine front will eventually produce. They are getting closer and closer. And personally, I think we'll see answers before 2030. I've been saying that, and that's not some new prediction. I've been saying 2030 since 2010. So back then I thought it was going to take 20 years. Now I think it's going to take 8 years. So because we are closer.
So it's different. Your 2030 is different from the UNA's 2030. You think of it in a different manner.
Maybe.
In the scientific community, are there people to carry the torch?
Yeah, I mean, most of the activists today are far younger, far more diverse than the old white guys like David and I. We work mostly with people in their 20s and 30s and 40s. And David and I are now in our 60s. Tony Fauci's leaving government at the end of this year, as we've heard. There'll be a new director of NIAID that these younger activists will get to know and start to press. So the torch has been passed. And that's what gets me past the morning cup of coffee. The knowledge and that energy that comes from those younger activists. And we're all connected because of the internet around the world. All the AIDS activists kind of know each other. They know who the players are. We help each other. And that's a huge asset. We no longer are, the queer community of New York en masse taking to the streets. We don't have that particular kind of power, but we have a different kind of power. Our expertise, our knowledge of the system, our international connectedness, and our actual diversity of patient groups, former IV drug users, women of color who are HIV positive, around the world, and that's a huge strength.
If you think of let's say Kyrgyz trans person who is watching Pose and crying about his identity or her identity, if you think of the young Russian person who just knew that he has HIV and started Google it up on the internet and somehow sees this thing. And if you think of somebody who thinks to do something, but thinks that he doesn't lack, or he does lack knowledge, or he doesn't have enough power, what would you tell them?
To do what I did the first day I found out I was HIV positive. Jump on a learning curve. Start trying to find out what's going on. Learn about HIV. Learn about what's going on in your community around HIV. What organizations exist. The great thing, I mean, I was lucky that I was in New York because there were already AIDS groups. But now, throughout the world, pretty much every city has an AIDS organization. Find out who they are. Walk in and get connected and make friends with the people who are doing activism near you and join the movement. It's there. That's the great thing. There's not a country in the world that doesn't have AIDS activists. Find them, join them.
Peter Stейли. Thank you, guys. Thank you, Peter, for your time.
Thanks, Dennis. It's good to see you again. Keep up the fight.